Hello, and welcome to the Goddess Liberation Movement. Kristen and I are going to be talking about the really amazing changes that have transpired over the past 5 decades that have helped us to be who we are in the world without great fear of punishment. Would you say that that's what we're going to be talking about? That we get to kind of have our spirituality the way it makes sense to us, and we don't really live in fear.
Yes. Yes.
So we're calling this the Goddess Liberation Movement. We're going to be talking about the history of the past, I guess, 5 decades, and then our own experiences, and talking about like creating our own spiritualness. I'm not like Kristen, I'm not a huge fan of the word religion,
Right.
but I do like a religion of one's own, creating my own religion. Nature is my religion, all these things.
Mm-hmm.
So settle in. If you've got an image of any goddess, Hecate or otherwise, around you, you might want to just bring it into vision as we explore this history and how the goddess has been liberated in society in so many ways and personally. So let's start with our candle. So here's to the goddess, here's to witchcraft, queerness, intersectionality, just being who you are in the world and being safe to do so. So let's do some cleansing, just starting to create that energy for all those who aren't free, aren't fully participating in the goddess liberation movement, removing any binding chains around them. And now let's cast that circle, connecting us to the goddess of our understanding, Hecate, her companions, whoever it is for you, and connecting and protecting. And I'm going to read a poem that is in my book, Entering Hecate's Cave. So this is in the Rixapile chapter. And it's called My Goddesses Are Wild and Free. My goddesses are wild and free, inconvenient, independent, rebellious, resistors, revengers. My goddesses are wild and free, hunting the wicked, conquering monsters, turning fools into swine, driving dragon chariots across the sun, shining pale moonbeams, burning torches, all the stars above and the deepest depths. My goddesses are wild and free, many faces, many moods. They scare the life into me. Shakers, movers, chain breakers, dream haunters, screaming whispers, dead silence. Enduring, changing, fleeing, remaining. My darkest desires, my brightest dreams. My goddesses are wild and free. Death walkers, truth talkers, troublemakers, impatient with fakers, claiming those they desire, casting others into the fire. My goddesses are wild and free, answering my call, showing up uninvited, forever traveling their road, leaving behind a trail that I choose to follow. My goddesses are wild and free. So the story of that poem, Kristen, I think you already know this story, but I'm going to tell it again anyway. Um, the story of this poem is I think it dates back several years now. And at the time, I was getting a lot of pushback for how I interpret some of the ancient writings about Hecate and applying like a healing, psychological, spiritual lens instead of trying to be like what they call a reconstructionist. I've never said I was that, but I was getting all this pushback at the time. Hecate is this, and she's only this, and what you're doing is wrong, and Hecate is going to get you for it. And I was really in this firestorm of these people just throwing all this vitriol at me. And I thought, what is this all about? And I was pretty worked up. Like I was not happy. I was ready to tear a strip off of people. And I thought, what is this all about? Like you can fight with these people, or you can just completely disengage, go your own way. And then the poem just came to me almost as is. It's like we fundamentally see goddesses differently. Mine are wild and free. Myths and rituals and religions touch upon them, but it's all about stretching beyond something that's so much greater than our mortal understanding could ever be. They're wild and free. And we tell stories and we do rituals and all the things we do to connect with them. And why that connection is so powerful, we're never entrapping them. Like we're not putting them on a shelf or reducing them to human attributes. They're wild and free and eternal and primordial and beautiful and horrible and all of these things to me. And I think that in hindsight, that poem was a much better response than me arguing with people. Because what's the point? Like sometimes it is fun just to argue with people. I'll admit it.
Occasionally.
Occasionally, right? Like it's just like, but ultimately it always makes me feel bad afterwards. Even if I like am self-indulgent and be like, let me tell you how I really think, sir.
Mm-hmm.
Afterwards, I'm always, but you didn't have integrity. You gave away your power. You knew going into this situation that nothing you would say would be a benefit to me or the other people or anybody. It was just like be mean for the sake of being mean or arguing for the sake of arguing. My dad always used to say that to me. You just like to argue for the sake of arguing. He also used to say I should be a lawyer because I love arguing so much. But I think like debate about different ideas is different than a lot of what goes on social media.
Mm-hmm.
Like, 'cause a lot of it is like, oh, you just fundamentally see the goddess differently. Okay, tell me how you see her. And I see her this way.
Mm-hmm.
And like that we're both listening and learning from each other instead of being like defensive. Well, my way is the only way. And if you don't see it that way, therefore you are wrong and bad. So I think the goddess liberation movement, I hope, has that room within it that we can see things differently and respect each other.
Mm-hmm.
Though I don't know, Kristen, social media has done a number on a lot of people.
It has.
But it's also beautiful and connects us because I think part of the goddess liberation movement has been technology, has been that we can connect to each other. That if we're goddess lovers and witches, we have a way of coming together now. So I think there's a lot of benefits to it, but there's also kind of that, like everything has an illuminated side and everything has a shadow side.
Right. And I think there's a growth process too.
Yeah, there's a growth process. And I think that's part of like liberating the goddess is like taking her out of being flatlined. Like she gets to have a shadow side too.
Yeah.
Okay. We have prepared some slides as we're going to do a little bit of chronology. And I think some of the things we have you might already know, and some might be a little bit surprising. So, Kristen, I tried to put together the crossroads of some of the intersections that, like for me, have been relevant in my own life. And then I think a lot of others maybe resonate with. So intersectionality is just this idea. Well, it's not just this idea. It's a school of thought that says when you have multiple things about you that push you outside of the mainstream, that all of these come together in an additive kind of way and make you more other. So it's this idea that there's like mainstream society and what's acceptable. And if you are on the margins, then you're not acceptable. Now, we're not saying this is anybody, like, it's not your fault. These are usually things that are like pushed on you, biases, discrimination, all of those horrible things. But I like it at the crossroads or the margins. I like where I occupy my life.
Yeah.
I've come to really, really to try to not be on some kind of straight road. Like my road is crooked and twisty, and there's a crossroads, and that's where Hecate is, at the crossroads, and that's where I live too.
Yeah.
So trying to link these kind of big ideas of intersectionality with my spirituality. I don't know. Does this make sense to you, Kristen?
It does make sense. Makes perfect sense.
Okay, so what are some of the things? Well, being a witch, which I've gone through periods in my life, like I was just like, I just wish this would go away. And all the parts of me that sing whenever I do anything witchy or talk about witchcraft or say I am a witch, all those things that feel so real and true and beautiful for me, I spent a lot of time wishing they could go away. And so I could fit in. I don't know. Have you ever done this? Like this thing of trying to fit into the mainstream world?
I've definitely done the thing of trying to fit in. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
I've definitely done the thing of trying to fit in, but I think mine was probably more rooted in fear. Like I don't think it's ever been something I've been like, oh, I wish this would go away. It was like, I'm scared to be who I am because, I'll be hated or discriminated against or attacked or something.
Right. Which is why I used to wish it would go away. Like my life will just be so much, I would think my life will be so much easier because no one will be thinking I'm a weirdo, or for me being a mom, no one will think treat my kids badly.
Or this idea that's ingrained in us that like there's something fundamentally wrong with us if we don't fit into like the norm.
Right. Obviously being goddess lovers, that puts us outside of, I guess Christianity is still in North America, at least, like it would still be like the most institutionalized religion. Though I know that's really falling apart, which is part of the goddess liberation movement. And then queerness and gender, being a well-educated white woman, some of these kind of things are much less pressing on me than for others, and I honor that and recognize that. And I don't know. What are your thoughts on these two, on this side of the crossroads?
Which do?
We're on queerness and gender.
Um, they're kind of in the same boat for me. And I think a lot of the struggles that I've encountered as far as like expressing my own spirituality have fallen in line with expressing my queerness, and there's also like a lot of that is my environment. Like I live in Mississippi. I'm very much in like a very right-wing religious, deep South, you know, state of being. And so it's a very different challenge, I think, for me than a lot of people. Um and for me, I think, I don't know, at the end of the day, like I said, I live in a place where different is just like not okay. Any flavor of different is not the flavor, you know.
Yeah.
Um yeah. So it all goes hand in hand. But I will say that sort of stepping into my own power and honoring like my own like sacredness and honoring the divine feminine and stuff has brought me like deeper in relation and like appreciation of like my own queerness and where I'm at in the world and like the changes that I'm making and what's rippling outward.
Safety is such a huge thing.
Yeah.
And like having these multiple identities that can be risky. And, I just acknowledge that, for other people, it's much riskier than for
Yeah.
people like me and you.
Yeah.
Trans people and so on, like they have people of color, that they have it's much, much riskier.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but it's risky when it's risky to be who you are in the world. Like it's a lot to kind of abide and like you said, find that place of personal empowerment.
Mm-hmm.
Or you're at the crossroads and that's your comfort zone, and then it gives you that strength to kind of go boldly forth into the world and
Mm-hmm.
navigate what other people might say.
Mm-hmm. You just opened up something up for me. I think it's important to say that it's okay to like honor where you are and honor your comfort level. Like I get this drive to like rebel and like push back and like just be all out and stuff, but like it's okay to like make sure you're comfortable and safe and okay, right? Like safety first. And you're no less valid in your witchiness or your queerness or like whoever you are. Unfortunately, like we live in a world where that has to happen sometimes. And I think something I've struggled with is like I want to be out and loud and proud and stuff, but I am very much in an environment where it's not safe. Like I want to be visible for others so they feel less alone and they feel supported, you know. But it is something to take into consideration. And it's okay. It's okay to be where
It's
you
okay.
are.
Yeah. You can hang out with us
Yeah.
and we say it's okay. And then the other two things I wanted to add to our crossroads for this discussion is this idea, and I use the word capacity instead of disability or chronic illness, inequity and so on, because I wanted like a word that instead of making people feel less than, like, no, if that's your capacity, like if your disability, if you have a disability, if you have a chronic illness, if you look a certain way in the world, like that's related to your capacity because it's how other people judge you. There's nothing like stop performing to try to make other people accept you. Focus on, like you said, be safe. You don't have to scream it. But if there's things about you that no matter what you do, when you're in the presence of some people, they're going to judge you.
Mm-hmm.
And then I thought more also about like, so there's the visible ones, but then there's the invisible things. People who have like significant mental illness.
Mm-hmm.
And I know in the witch world, there are a lot of us who have mental illness, chronic disease, and so on that other people can't see.
Mhm.
And not getting into a big conversation about what I think that means. Maybe that's another episode, like about what it means to walk with illness. Like,
Yeah.
but just this idea of you want to be visible for who you actually are and not what other people think of you.
Mhm.
And that makes you invisible. Like they
Yeah.
don't actually see you, they see who they think you are.
Right.
And they get to make a whole bunch of judgments about you based on just the way you look
Mhm.
or don't look. Like you
Mhm.
said, there's only one right way to be. So it's the way you don't look. Um, so there's a lot to kind of take in. But here we are with the good news, friends. Even though we live in these really upsetting political times, much progress has been made
Yeah.
over the last 50 years.
Yeah.
So, whether for you to be safe, you need to be quiet about this and, do a quiet revolution, or if you're able to be out and about and speaking out, just, you are carrying on all that has transpired in different movements that kind of converge all around what it means to be a witch, specifically a goddess loving witch, because we're goddess loving witches. So, but may also apply to like male deity loving witches. I don't want to bring in this whole complicated thing with Christian witches. We'll let them sort themselves out. But like if you are a follower of Pan, for example, or another pagan male deity, that it's like these are all interconnected. So let's kind of dive into some of the things that we pulled out. So I think we should mention that article that we both
Mhm.
read. So
Mhm.
this was an interesting article on the Western revival of goddess worship in feminist theology. This is really interesting because, I mean, you and I abide like at this crossroad of all these different identities, but
Mhm.
fundamentally, we are goddess lovers.
Mhm.
And the goddess movement linked to feminism is something that's really compelling for me. Like, I think of my own journey, like way back when I didn't know anything about feminism or goddesses.
Mhm.
And to me, they're just so linked together. But this is a good review article. So it is in Feminist Theology. It's a new article, 2023. So if you want to look that up and read it, she makes a lot of really great points. I think she left a lot of things out,
Mhm.
but it's a really, really great article. I don't know, what are your thoughts on what Dr. Nicolay had to say?
Um, I agree with you. It is a very great article. There are a couple of points that I may question, but overall, yeah. And I think it all comes back to, like you said, being wild and free and independent. It's about like personal empowerment, right? And like honoring ourselves and honoring the divine and sort of in the spirit of Rick Pile, like breaking those chains of conformity and like oppression. Yeah, it's a really great article.
Really, but it's really interesting. So we put together a bit of a timeline for the last 50 years. I just picked a couple of things. Obviously, we could have 1,000 things for each decade talking about this. Um, the 1970s, which even me at my advanced age, I don't really remember the 1970s much, but I do remember when I was in my teens later on reading these books. So, two books I decided to feature. Any of the books that I featured are books that were really important to me for different reasons. So, Starhawk's Spiral Dance, one of my very first witchy Wicca pagan goddess books. Um, And Starhawk, to me, like I had the honor of doing a ritual with her a few years ago. To me, she embodies this part of the goddess movement. That is, it's activism. You know, she's an eco-feminist. She really was one of the first best-selling authors of Wicca. And Drawing Down the Moon, I like that less. But I found I found a photo online. My copy doesn't have this cover because I have a newer edition, but just that naked woman on the cover, you know, it's like I get a little uncomfortable with this aspect because it's like, let's not just sexualize the goddess either.
Right.
Like she's many, many things, but there was definitely that there's this feminist movement of the goddess, and then there's also this kind of hyper-sexualized business that happened in the 60s and 70s with some books.
Mhm.
But I think like you talk like women's sexual liberation was also occurring, right? And you know what I mean? Like women were going to work, women were on the pill, women, you know, this is back in the days when before Roe v. Wade was overturned, but when it was first, you know, when it was first a decision, there was a lot of sexual liberation going on then, and a lot of the origins of like the queer movement were happening during the 70s too. So all of these things were happening. The goddess was getting liberated in kind of these different ways, and there were these really popular books and so on. So that's kind of how things got started. One of my favorite books is a little tiny book from this era called Lost Goddesses of Ancient Greece, which I didn't put on this slide. And so, Kristen, I know you were much too young to remember the 70s as well.
Yeah.
But like, have you ever visited with any of these older books, like Drawing Down the Moon or Spiral Dance?
A Spiral Dance, yes. I'm a big fan of Starhawk and I actually still follow Starhawk. And I wanted to say also, I'm glad you turned me on to Jean Shinola Bolin. It's just amazing. Just amazing.
She is amazing. So Goddesses in Every Woman is different. So Starhawk was talking about, you know, we kind of got like Starhawk, Drawing Down the Moon, and a bunch of other books that are more about the practice of Wicca, what it was called Wicca for the most part then. There was in the 70s, like the mainstream kind of idea, like Wicca became a religion. I think we need to talk about that because I don't consider myself Wiccan. Do you consider yourself Wiccan?
No, no,
But I will tell
I
you,
don't.
like, I have been called Wiccan so many times. Have you been called Wiccan by people?
Yes, yes, quite often.
And it's like, but no, I don't. But then it gets to the point, like, I know when I used to be back in the work world, like the mainstream work world, even to say you were Wicca was a little bit odd, but nobody could actually make too much of a fuss of it because you were kind of claiming like that as a religious identity.
Mm-hmm.
So I think I'm certainly influenced by a lot of the early books I read in different ways, like, but I've never considered myself Wiccan. Goddesses in Every Woman in the 80s comes along, writing about the goddesses. I love Jean Shinoda Boland's work. Jean Shinoda Boland's work. I always wonder why she steered so far clear of any like darker. Well, I don't like the term darker, but you know, like Hecate, the more, you know, like why she kind of, it's almost like she made them safer. I think she made them more approachable and less intimidating. So I think it was really an important book, and it was the right book for what's for the time, and it's certainly the right book now. Although I would say authors today, of which I am included, you know, we have a lot more liberation around how we write about the goddess and what probably would have gotten published in the 70s and 80s.
Mm-hmm.
Um, one important event in the 1980s, I've already mentioned, is that Wicca gets recognized both in Canada and the United States as an official religion through different court cases in both of our countries. So it did legitimize Wicca. And that's a huge, like, huge change. I mean, Wicca as a religion really grew out of the 1950s and 60s. And then you talk about activism, right? You talk about people who are willing to speak up and change the world. These court cases gave protection to Wicca, but not witchcraft necessarily. And then it becomes like, what box do you check on the hospital form? Have you ever had to do this? Like, you're going in for a procedure.
Yeah, 100%. And I do. I have checked that box multiple times.
Yeah.
I just keep thinking about like what a progressive step forward looks like, you know, and sometimes it is needing to check that box, and sometimes it is making things more approachable, you know, but change is happening.
Change is happening. Look at how far we've come. Okay, ready for the 90s?
Yeah.
I'll just let you talk about the craft. I'll just go get a drink or something.
I mean, what can I say about that? I think it served its purpose to bring witchcraft into the spotlight. I have a lot of problems with it. You know, but it did sort of bring it mainstream.
And it was hugely popular. I mean, I think it continues to be hugely popular.
Yeah.
They did a reboot of it, I think, a few years ago.
Yeah.
I missed the movie. I had a baby. I was a single parent going to university. I don't think I watched any movies in the 90s that weren't from Disney. So, you know, it's funny because everyone's like, oh, the craft. I love the craft. And I'm like, never seen it. So the judgment on the movie, I was busy. I was doing my little spells and rituals on my own and had no idea that this movie even existed. But I know this movie is really important to a lot of people because it opened something in them.
Yeah.
And I think that's what happened in the 90s in different books, in different, not just the craft, but in other ways. There was like an opening where what had kind of started as, we like, you know, the goddess feminism, but it's a nice, safe kind of goddess. And Wicca, not witchcraft, it's a nice, safe kind of paganism religion thing that in the 90s, I think it started to crack.
Yeah.
And then along comes the 2000s. And for me, first of all, can I say that talking about the 2000s as being over 20 years ago seems odd to me, but indeed it was. That so many books became bestsellers. I put up To Ride a Silver Broomstick by Silver Ravenwolf. It is a sentimental favorite of mine. But also, like, Christopher Penczak started to publish books. We haven't talked about Scott Cunningham, but I mean, he was a bit earlier, but so many, like, it just, like, the craft happened. The internet started to happen, things like Witch's, what it was called, Witch's Voice, Witch Fox, paganspace.net, paganspace.net, all of these things. Like, as we got the internet, we had access to each other and feeling like we weren't alone. And then these books were coming up and websites were going up. And so much really just started to happen in the 2000s, wouldn't you say? Okay, where were you at with all this in the 2000s?
What was that? I was just thinking about that. And I think I did sort of, where was it in 2000? I was like 18, 19. And I did sort of get roped into it. Like, it was very appealing. Like, I sort of related, but I was still kind of unsure. And to bring it back to the craft, like, I mean, you know, when you're that age, I think it's important to like be represented in a certain way. And like, you see these characters are like these really cool, like powerful, you know, women. But at the same time, it's just like so stereotypical. And yeah, and Scott Cunningham, I think, was probably my first introduction. I remember being like 19 and getting like Scott Cunningham's Encyclopedia of Magical Herbs. And that was like my gateway. That was like my early 2000s gateway into witchcraft.
Mine was solitary witchcraft. I'm like, and that's where I belong. But it was also for me, I don't know if that you had this experience. Like, I love these books and they cracked me open.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I was like, this is good, but it's not quite
Yeah.
for me. Not for like I wasn't, it's not a criticism of any of this, but it's just like it was close. It was a lot closer than sitting in the evangelical Pentecostal pew. I'll tell you that.
Right. I think you're right. It opened something up. And it wasn't until later, like maybe a decade later that I came back and like revisited it from like a more spiritual perspective and, kind of said, oh, okay, this is where I'm at.
Okay. So then things happen in the 2010s. And so I picked these two things. I already mentioned Christopher Penczak because I think he's really worthy of mention as, the founder of the Temple of Witchcraft, the author of all of these important books in the 2000s and 2010s. Like he really was the first big organization because of like social media and the internet and his professionalism and his just intellectual gifts and so on. Like he was really able to do something with the Temple of Witchcraft, and it wasn't called the Temple of Wicca. Like I remember back then, there were so many the online school of Wicca. Everything was Wicca, 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 like Wicca, Wicca all the time. And even if, like me, you thought, well, I'm not really Wiccan. I don't really. It's beautiful, but it's not quite right in my soul. It's not quite there yet. To me, the Temple of Witchcraft and those books that were so bold. And not only were they bold about loving goddesses and pagan gods, but they were also bold about witchcraft and they were bold about queerness. Like they were just bold. There was so much audacity into what Christopher did. And I just wanted to, to give him his due for being such a leader. And at the same time, as much as I admire him, for me, I was thinking, like, this still isn't right. Like, I still don't see myself here. Like, I admire your books, they're super helpful, but it's not quite right for me. And then I also wanted to briefly mention this group, which as an acronym from Boston, and all of their political work, because I think it was in the 2010s that there started to be like political and social activism by people who call themselves witches, as opposed, like in really serious grown up ways, as opposed to calling themselves Wiccan. And I think that was a big movement. Like the definition of the word witch is really changing fast. We start in the 1970s. I looked at different sources, and, in the 70s, witch was still defined as a malevolent being, who curses and hexes and is basically evil. Here we are in the into the 2000s, but especially in the 2010s, when it's like witches can be all genders. Witches are like, it's a serious spiritual path. We aren't cartoons. We aren't evil. And I know I didn't include it, but if you go to the Oxford English Dictionary website, I think there's an article, but if you look at the entry for the word witch, they're tracking how much the Oxford English Dictionary has had to change their definition of witch and witchcraft in the past 50 years. Like that's phenomenal. Like like change is happening.
Yeah.
So where are we at today? So much. I mean, witchcraft is just everywhere today. And I was feeling a little overwhelmed and just trying to pick a couple of things because there's so many books and so many great publishers. And people online, and it's just witchcraft is everywhere today. And not even calling itself Wicca anymore. It's like we're out, and a lot of us are queer, have different capacities, disabled, or belong to a traditionally marginalized group, and we're just out there doing it, like loud and proud, or quietly, but connecting through technology, which has been so wonderful. But then I was thinking, and I Googled this, like, is this a good thing for witchcraft?
Right.
When witchcraft is everywhere? And is witchcraft too mainstream? Like, I started this with that crossroads image. And I think, like, as witches, like, we abide in the in-between, but it's like all of a sudden witchcraft has become in the mainstream, which I personally don't think is where it belongs. I think it's beautiful that people can find healing and empowerment by witchcraft, but I've always been here. And always will be here. It's fundamentally who I am in my soul, whether I like it or not. It's just who I am. And I think something I wanted to talk about, which I know can be controversial, is how witchcraft has become so consumerized.
Yeah.
This is something that's really changed. So all these beautiful, empowering, wonderful things have happened. And yet at the same time, because of the world in which we live, it's become consumerized, where, there's all these products, all these things that we can feel compelled to buy because we're a witch, or it'll make us more witchy, or whatever it is, not just because we love them, but because we feel like there's an obligation that if we have this herb or we have this statue, we're doing it right. You know what I mean? Like, it's weird, this consumerization of witchcraft.
Yeah, it's almost like we forget that the power lies within ourselves.
Right. That witchcraft doesn't need to cost a penny.
Yeah.
And I say this as someone who is a professional witch, author and teacher. I think to connect with spirits and the deeper world and do spells and so on, absolutely doesn't take any money. You might need some guidance, find authors, teachers you admire, and invest in that. But it's not like the size of your crystal collection. I'm going to tell you this story, and I don't know, some people might get offended by this story, but I'm going to tell it anyway. I remember years ago, I went to visit someone, and they were like witch with a capital W in every way. You know what I mean? Like, they were out, they wearing the pentacles. I really liked this person. I was quite enamored with them. And we went to their apartment, and they were so proud to show me their apothecary, their herbs and whatnot. And so they opened it up. It was this very beautiful, like, elaborate antique cupboard, and everything in it was perfectly labeled, perfectly arranged. It had never been used. And it wasn't dusty. There was no little, nothing had ever been used. It was just, they created this thing as like a shrine to herbalism, but they weren't actually doing herbalism in a physical way. Of course, you can work with the plant spirits and so on without, needing to engage directly with the plant matter. But I was just dumbfounded by this, because I've always been, since I was a little girl, like with the plants, and I'm doing things with the plants. I'm I'm cooking with them. I'm doing infusions for healing the body. I'm doing little talismans and bags and making potions and I'm always like, my apothecary could never look like that on its best day because I'm always doing things with it. And I think, I don't know, that just really blew me away. It's like,
Mhm.
isn't the point of witchcraft to do the witchcraft and not just collect the things?
Right.
And like I said, it might offend some people, but that's how I feel. If you don't feel, if someone feels differently, that's fine. And I'd love to hear how they connect if they don't actually work with the things. Like my stuff gets dirty, Kristen. How about yours?
Oh yeah. I mean, witchcraft for me is very hands-on. I mean, because I'm in active relation with these spirits, right? I'm in active relation with the things that I'm doing. It's not like a pretty thing on a shelf. It's not a status symbol. It's not like a collectible, like it's
They're tools. They're you know
tools. Yeah.
like accoutrements for my practice of witchcraft.
Yeah.
It's not fantasy. Like I do witchcraft. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and I think this really links into this article about witchcraft being too mainstream because I think something happens when things get so consumerized. Like you think, if I buy this one thing, if I take this pill, or if I do this, all these things, like if I do this thing, I'll lose 100 pounds. Or if I do this thing, I'll get the love of my dreams. Like I think we can go too far into that. And it's really easy. I'm not
Mm-hmm.
criticizing anybody that this happens to, but it's really easy because of the way advertising works in our society. It can convince us that it's that easy. But I would say like witchcraft is the craft of the wise, and it takes time,
Mm-hmm.
um, and years, and it's not like a point and click thing on Amazon. If you actually want to practice witchcraft, as opposed to just having the beautiful things around, which is, there's nothing wrong with having beautiful things around.
Mm-hmm. I have a question. Do you think
Okay.
that there's something about sort of the excitement around claiming that identity? Like I'm listening to you talking, I'm thinking about my own intersection of like, witchcraft and queerness and stuff. And I'm thinking about what it's like to like come out of the closet, to like come out of the closet or come out of the broom closet. And you're just like so excited and you want to like shout it from the rooftop. And like you want to like embellish yourself with all the things and like wear the pinnacles and wear the rainbows and like just be a part of this movement. And I think that there is a lot of that in this.
And I think that's really beautiful too. Like it's
Yeah.
so, I don't want to seem like I'm criticizing people who get started with witchcraft because, they're like, this feels like who I am, like with
Yeah.
your or witch or like whatever you identify as. Like, that's your right to identify as you and to express it as you want. I'm an old grouchy witch, and sometimes I say grouchy things. Um, but
It's exciting to take up that space, right? To have the freedom to take up that space.
this is who I am.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I apologize for being a grouchy witch that was really confused by the clean apothecary. Is witchcraft too mainstream? But linking back to what we were talking about before, our side tangents. You do you is the ultimate thing.
Yeah.
Um, so in this article, they interview Dr. Helen Berger, who's from Brandeis University, and she has been tracking like religious affiliation through surveys for decades. And what she was saying is that it's gone this trajectory where people used to say they were Wiccan, but now they'll say they're witch. And that she's finding that being an eclectic witch is the most like common response on her surveys,
Mhm.
which I think is really interesting. I mean, because I've always wondered like that, people have always, like for the past 2 decades, people have thrown that label at me. And I was like, I don't feel very eclectic. I actually feel quite organized and normal to myself. If you view me as eclectic, that's fine. But, eclectic in the sense that you're borrowing from different paths and kind of like creating your own spirituality or your own religion. I think that's like, what a amazing thing to have the power to do because of technology. Because, like, so it's like the shadowy sides of consumerism, the shadowy sides of technology, but the illuminated side is like, look at what we are so being empowered that we can have the resources to do this. And grouchy, middle-aged, not quite Chrome, but almost Chrome Witch is here to say to you, you also don't need anything to create your own spirituality.
Yeah.
But I just thought it was interesting, like looking at like culture and the books that are coming out and the different kind of popular websites and whatnot, that even like research data is supporting this, that there's this movement away from people saying they're Wiccan to now you can be a hedge witch, or you can be like us, Hecatean witches, or whatever kind of witch you want to be, that's something that's really changed and really beautiful too. Though I think it's also important to remember, like, let's not fight amongst ourselves to try to say who's right and who's wrong. Like, let's hold space. Everybody can be different here. Just the fact that we can have a discussion about our differences is amazing, because 50 years ago, the Oxford English Dictionary said we were all evil. So there's a lot to this. Okay. So we wanted to conclude. So this is this little section. It's called a practica in my book, Entering Hecate's Cave. It's about creating your own personal religion. So I think that's, for me, one of the most amazing things about this whole goddess liberation movement is the empowerment to create your own religion, your own spirituality. And the freedom, like, is witchcraft too mainstream? Well, maybe yes, in some ways, but also, yay, because it's giving us all that freedom. And just, like you said about when people have that realization, yeah, I am a witch. Oh my goddess, I am a witch. Or maybe not, maybe they're not into goddesses, but they have that realization and like, yeah, give me all the things I want. I know who I am. Like, I think that's so empowering. And I think it's so empowering that we can find a coven or a group that really resonates with us. And we can also like craft our own spirituality. It's so amazing. Now we need to be mindful of, like harmful practices and, being culturally appropriative and so on. And we're doing this, but there's so much richness in the world. And I think eclectic witchcraft, drawing from different sources, doing what makes sense to you, I think that's so empowering and rewarding.
Yeah. And there's something there about like connecting to our own sacredness.
And we didn't even have time to touch on that. But I think a theme running through the goddess liberation movement is that we are all sacred, that we're not sinners cast out of the Garden of Eden. We're not evil, that we're sacred, and that we're important to this world. And, we deserve to be taken seriously. There's a lot to this, and this is just like the briefest kind of conversation about this topic. I hope your goddesses are wild and free as you understand them, and that you are fully embracing the goddess liberation movement. Thanks so much for joining us. Bye.
Hail Hecate.
Hail Hecate.